Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. This week let's paint up some really bright orange on the Leagues of Votann Kill Team. I liked the color scheme on the box art, but I felt like it could use a few changes, especially adding some more orange. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the models, I undercoated them with white primer. I think it'll be easier to paint the heads separately, so I drilled a piece of wire and attached them to corks. First I painted the skin with a layer of Fyreslayer flesh. Next I painted all the orange areas with Magmadroth flame. The models on the box art don't have very much orange on them, and the bright orange is really what defines these models for me, so I decided to add some more. I painted the top portion of the armor, the knee pads, and the back of the hands. I also painted some orange on the head with a helmet. I'll add more orange to the models later, but that will be with opaque paint. I'd like to add some shading to the orange, so I applied some Targor Rageshade. I tried to direct the shade into the recesses where I could, but on some areas I just applied it all over. I don't want the shadows to get too dark though, so make sure to soak up any excess paint with the brush. Next I painted the chest, trousers, boots, and gloves with black Templar. I'm not too worried if some of the paint gets on the other areas, except I'm doing my best to keep the orange as clean as possible. It can be kinda tricky to reach a lot of these areas and paint around the coats, and you may find it easier to paint the model in a sub-assembly. I'd like the gloves and boots to be a darker shade of black, to help distinguish them from the shirt and trousers. I thinned down some black Templar with water, about equal parts, and painted a glaze to darken the boots and gloves. Next I base coated all the brown areas with Wyldwood. The box art has a lot of different shades of brown, and I think it's a few too many. I believe that fewer colors make for a stronger color scheme and composition. I'd like to cut the number of browns down to just 3, a dark, medium, and light tone, and Wyldwood will provide a good base coat for each of those. I'm not worried if some of the paint spills on the unpainted areas, like the metals, since I'll be using opaque paint for those anyway, but just like with the black Templar layers earlier, I want to be really careful around the orange. Wyldwood can look kinda streaky with just one layer, especially over such a light primer. On the light and medium brown leather it won't matter, but I want to paint a glaze layer on the darker brown sections. I thinned the paint with an equal amount of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I applied it to the outside of the coats. There should be just enough paint to cover the surface, and it shouldn't flow or pool in the crevices. The goal here is to evenly tint the layers beneath, rather than flooding the surface. This approach will help make the finish look smooth and less streaky. I painted the medium brown sections next with Steel Legion Drab. I painted the pouches, backpacks, and the inside of the coats. Try to avoid the cracks and preserve the dark line along the edge of the trim. That will help define the shapes. If you make any mistakes, it's easy to correct with Wyldwood. Next I painted the belt, straps, and backpack trim with Zandri dust. Again, I'm trying to avoid the crevices and allow the dark base coat to work like a recess shade. After the first layer dries, you may want to paint a second for an even finish. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. A few of the models have some fur on their cloaks, and I base coated those with Stormvermin fur. If you want some more ideas about painting fur, check out this Fenrisian Wolves tutorial here. Before I shade the fur, I'd like to base coat a couple other things first, then I can shade it all at once. I painted all the metal areas with Iron Hand steel, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. I'm not worried about getting any silver paint on the other parts of the gun, since I'll be painting those with opaque paint later. Then I painted the first model's beard with Balor brown. I base coated the hair on the other model with gray number 4 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set here. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Dawnstone is a close match. With those areas base coated, next I shaded them with a custom mix I like to call Armor Wash. This is a mix of equal parts Ratling Grime, Lahmian Medium, and Contrast Medium. It used to be an equal parts mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, but I prefer a stronger tone, so I developed this mix. A subscriber recently asked why the mix has both Lahmian and Contrast Medium, instead of just one or the other. This is a great question, and it has to do with the difference between shade and contrast paints. Shades tend to have more of a dispersion agent in them, which is what makes the paint flow off the raised surfaces and into the recesses. Contrast paints tend to have less dispersion agent in them, and they tend to sit on the surface a little more. I did some tests and varied the ratio of mediums, and I found that I liked this mix the best. Also, a mix with equal parts is much easier for everyone to replicate, compared to something more complicated, and I feel like that is important as well. Next I painted Runelord brass on the dagger sheath, the bottom of the handle, and the shells on the backpack. Then I shaded the brass with Targor Rageshade. I painted all the remaining areas with black. I painted the dagger blade with gray number 8 from my custom grayscale, making sure to leave a thin black outline where it meets up against the metal. Then I painted the blade with Aethermatic blue. At this stage you could base the models and call them finished, but I'd like to add some more details and highlights, so let's keep going. Before I highlight the orange, I'd like to add a few more orange sections to the model. It'll take too long to repaint those areas white and cover them again with contrast paint, so instead I'm using opaque paint. This is a mix of equal parts Wild Rider red and Jokaero orange. I painted the little circle shapes on the boots and a stripe along the gun. If I painted these sections first along with the rest of the orange, I think it would be too difficult to try and avoid making mistakes. I think it's easier and faster to just paint them now with an opaque paint. Next I started brightening the orange armor with glazes of Fire Dragon. Thin the paint with water, and with barely any paint on the brush, build up layers until you're happy with the results. You could paint just the edges if you want a darker looking orange. Or for a very bright orange, you could layer the paint everywhere except for the crevices. I'm going for more of a brighter look, so I'm building up a few glazes. The orange is looking nice and bright now, and I'd like to apply an edge highlight, and for that I'll use a mix of Fire Dragon and Toxic Yellow. A popular color for highlighting bright orange is Lugganoth orange, but I'm not a fan of it. Let's compare it with the toxic yellow mix. Lugganoth orange looks very pink in comparison, and I prefer the mix for highlights. I think the yellow tone helps emphasize the edges more. Next, I started highlighting the dark brown cloaks, with a mix of Dryad bark and a small amount of Mournfang brown. Depending on how dark your contrast layers are, you may need to adjust your mix slightly. I thinned the paint with water, and with barely any paint on my brush, I applied a few glazes on the raised edges and folds. Also, look for any remaining areas that need to be smoothed out. I'm not worried about going over the edge trim. I think it's easier to paint the broad areas of the cloak first, and then go back later and refine the trim. With the soft glazes applied, next I added some sharp edge highlights with Mournfang brown. You could glaze these highlights instead if you want a softer result. Next, I touched up the jacket trim with Wyldwood. There are a few spots where the highlight got into the crevices, and I fixed those. Rather than avoiding the crevices while painting the highlights, I think I get much cleaner results by painting over them and touching up afterwards, and it seems like it's faster as well. I mixed about equal parts Mournfang brown and Jokaero orange and painted over all the trim, leaving a thin, dark outline. You could paint it with just Mournfang brown if you don't feel like mixing anything. Moving on to the medium brown leather next. I mixed some white into the Steel Legion Drab for the first highlight, and I painted it on the edges of the backpack and the inside of the jacket. I don't mind mixing, but if you'd prefer to use paint straight out of the pot, Baneblade Brown would be a close match. I'd like to take it one step further with another highlight on the sharpest edges and corners. I mixed in some more white, and I tried to keep the highlights sharp and narrow. You could skip this step if you want, but I think it adds some nice definition to the model, and it doesn't take too long. Next, I highlighted the light brown areas with an edge highlight of Bonewhite. Bonewhite is a pretty big jump up in value from the base coat of Zandri dust, so you may want to mix a midtone first. I find that the bigger the step up in value, the smaller and more precise your highlights need to be. So if you skip the midtone step, just remember that you'll want to keep your Bonewhite highlights very narrow and precise. I highlighted the fur with a mix of Stormvermin fur and a small amount of Bonewhite. I think painting the hair individually looks better, but you could dry brush it if you want to save time. Let's move on to highlighting the black next, starting with the shirt and pants. I'd like this black to have a cooler tone, to complement all the warm tones on the model. I highlighted the edges with Thunderhawk blue, thinned with water, and I painted a couple transparent layers in a glaze-like style. I'd like the gloves and boots to have a warm highlight, so I highlighted the edges of those with Stormvermin fur. I avoided painting the toe of the boots. I think I'll paint that a little differently next. We have a warm black and a cool black, and now I'd like to have a neutral black on the guns and the toes of the boots. I painted a sharp edge highlight with gray number 2 from my custom grayscale, and if you don't feel like mixing anything, Eshin Gray is pretty close. I added one more highlight to the sharpest edges and corners with gray number 4 from my custom grayscale. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Dawnstone is a close match. The box art has some really cool looking blades, and it's easy to paint with glazes of Lupercal green. Thin the paint with a small amount of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, start building up layers on the blade. There should be barely any paint going on the model, and it should dry almost as soon as it leaves the brush. Lupercal green is very weak and transparent, which normally would be a problem if you want an opaque color. But in the case of glazing, we're building up depth with lots of transparent layers, and weak paints are great for this kind of technique. Gradually build up the highlights towards the edges until the color is dark and rich. Once I was happy with the color of the blades, I highlighted the edges with thinned white paint. Next, I highlighted the edges of the metal with Stormhost silver. Just a couple details left to go. I painted black over all the rivets, buttons, and lenses. Then I painted all the rivets and buttons again with Stormhost silver, leaving a thin black outline. Next, I painted all the lenses with white, again leaving a thin black outline. Gems and lenses are really easy to paint with contrast. I painted the goggles with a few layers of Aeldari emerald. I made the first layer really thin and even, and after that dried, I painted another layer focused near the top. This is pretty similar to how I painted the blade. Just slowly build up a few layers, focusing more paint on the top, until you're happy with the gradation. If you want to see more about how to paint gems this way, check out my Tomb Kings video here. Then I painted a couple white reflective dots. Then I cleaned up the edge with some black paint, followed by Stormhost silver. I painted a thin layer of Casandora yellow on the center detail, and after that dried, I painted another dot of Casandora yellow in the center, kind of a sneaky way of getting a highlight on the edges. I attached the head to the model with super glue, and then I used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue on the base. Then I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Mournfang brown, then Baylor brown, and finally a light dry brush of Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with Mournfang brown, and after that dried, I added patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. Overall, I think I'm happy with the color scheme, especially the extra orange. Normally I go for a lot of bright colors on my models, and it's hard for me to get used to so many browns. I don't think the different shades of black worked very well though. It felt kind of excessive, and it's not very noticeable either. In the future, I think I would stick with just one tone. Maybe the neutral grays I used on the weapon. What do you think? Are my changes effective? What would you do differently? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.